All right, let's see if we can make some sense of stanza 2 of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. As we'll see, there's been a ton of critical debate about the merits of the description here. In fact, Shelley's reputation has even been debated and has been tested in relation to these particular lines, but we'll save some of the scholarly opinion for the end of this video. So let's start here then with this description where it says, "Thou on whose stream, mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed." And the idea here is that in stanza 1, we talked about leaves, right? Leaves being driven by the west wind. And now it's the clouds that are being driven by the west wind. So this is the point of comparison. But Shelley will use this imagery of trees and really develop it in these lines. So the idea here then is that if we have the sky, okay, and we have these clouds, we can imagine all these clouds in the sky. There we go. Then this is the air stream, the air currents that we have here. So that's the word stream. And it's a very tall sky. So think of it as like the steep sky. It goes straight up and there's so many different clouds all the way along. Commotion, of course, it has the sense of turbulence, lots of activity going on. There's a storm brewing. And it says then, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed. So you can imagine that these different clouds here, right, they're kind of like individual leaves that are being shed, that are falling down from some kind of tree. But then we do wonder, well, where is the tree? It says, shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean. And boughs is just an old word for branches. So now I think what you should imagine is that if you have water, so let's put water at the front here. I guess these should be waves. Then what often happens is that vapors go up, right? So this is what creates the storm. There we go. And this is how the clouds are formed. And you can now start to see that this looks a little bit like trees. So if you kind of make this into branches, doesn't it look a bit like a tree? You really have to use your imagination. But you can sort of imagine that as the water and the heaven, the sky, becomes one, the horizon starts to disappear and it's harder to see what's going on. And all of this, in a sense, gets mixed together. Then it says, angels of rain and lightning. Now this refers back to the clouds, those clouds that we had before. And the word angels, going back to the Greek, really means messengers. So messengers. And of course, the clouds at this point, they're getting darker and darker and darker. This is getting very messy as well. But eventually, they will drop their rain and they will cause lightning. That isn't happening yet, but we see the message, in a sense, of what's going to happen later. There are spread, Shelley writes on the blue surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce Maenad. Okay. So the blue surface then is the whole sky here that we had before. The airy surge, we have this kind of upward motion as the wind pushes the clouds. And the motion, the surge, is somewhat similar to the hair on a Maenad. Now, who are the Maenads? Well, the Maenads were followers of Dionysus or Bacchus in ancient times. And they were kind of known for being crazy. In fact, in one of the stories, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, we read that Orpheus, the great poet Orpheus, is torn to shreds by the Maenads. They rip him up. And the Maenads, in turn, are being punished for this, for killing Orpheus. They're being punished by being turned into oak trees. And the critic James Rieger has pointed out some of these connections. And the one line he draws attention to is the fact that their wind-tossed hair became leaves. So maybe Shelley has that image in mind. But the main connection with Maenads is this sense of frenzy. There's a frenzy to them. They kind of run through the woods in a wild way. And so if you've ever done that thing where you touch a ball and at a science center or something like this, and your hair all goes static, maybe you've had something like that. Think of that static hair being uplifted, and that's what the storm is looking like. right? So you can imagine now that what we before described as these tangled boughs, you can also describe as hair if you want. This is all hair going straight up, uplifted from the head of some fierce Maenad. Even from the dim verge, so the verge is the edge or the margin, so that would be the horizon in this case, of the horizon to the zenith's height, and the zenith is the highest point straight above you. So we're saying all the way from here, all the way to the top, we see the locks of the approaching storm, and this picks up that notion of the Maenad's hair. So in other words then, as you're looking from a vantage point further away, what you see is this storm coming towards you as if it has locks of hair streaming towards you. Then Shelley writes, "Thou dirge of the dying year," and notice all these D's here, right? Dirge and dying and dome. This has a sense of impending doom, you might say, another word that kind of sounds like dome. And a dirge is a funeral song. So the idea here is that it's the end of the year. It's the fall time. The year is dying as well. And this closing night, right, one of these final nights in autumn, will be the dome of a vast sepulchre. So a dome is a curved vault, and that turns into kind of a curved tower, right, top of a tower. So what we have here then is that the sky is becoming extremely dark. And I really should use like black or something, right? So it feels like the storm creates this sense of enclosure, as if you're being buried alive. Nice connection with dirge there. He goes on, vaulted, right? So the vault is the top of the church, this curved section, with all thy congregated might. Thy here is the west wind. Congregated literally means pulled together, drawn together. And the wind pulls everything together, creates this sense of a dome, of a sepulcher, which is a tomb. You really feel like you're being buried alive. And all of this might is of vapors, water vapors, as we've said before, from whose solid atmosphere, now water isn't solid, but as I keep drawing these, this pattern here, you're starting to get the sense of something very solid, right? As if it's a building, as if it's a structure. And from this solid atmosphere, black rain and fire and hail will burst. Oh, here. So as you see, he starts with thou, and he ends with oh, here. Same structure as in the first stanza, and we get a pretty good sense of how sublime this is, because as we've said before, sublimity in this period is often associated with terror, with fright, and what's more scary than watching a storm and feeling like you are being buried alive by it. All right, so we've talked about the basic meaning of these lines, at least as I interpret them. Let's come back to this issue of critical perspectives. And the critic F.R. Leavis is infamous for having some very negative things to say about these particular lines. His main objection is that Shelley's language in these opening lines here is extremely loose, kind of like the clouds he's describing. It's very difficult to imagine what specifically he's talking about. So here are a number of objections he comes up with. First of all, to what extent are loose clouds like falling leaves? Now, I think that's maybe a bit of a stretch. I mean, we can use our imagination and think of clouds falling down or being driven across the sky as similar to leaves. I don't have a problem with that, but Leavis does raise this objection. He also asks, well, how can something be shed on or in a stream, if we take this image of a stream more literally? Then he says, what are those tangled boughs of heaven and ocean? Do they point to anything real? Now, as we said before, we're talking about, this impression of vapor being lifted up or rising to form clouds. But he has a point. Are they really like branches? Bit of a stretch. Where is the tree in all this? Leavis asks. He also wonders if there's not a contradiction between the smooth surface, right, the blue surface, and then this much rougher, airy surge. How do we connect these two things? And then he says, well, how is a storm like streaming hair? That seems a bizarre image. And he also actually wonders, is it possible for hair to stream out in front of someone? He seems to have this idea that the maenads with their hair, as they're being compared here, that the hair is streaming straight forward, which doesn't make sense scientifically. But as other critics have pointed out, it only says that it's uplifted, right? It doesn't actually say anything about a direction. So maybe Leavis is being too literal here, trying to imagine this. If you add all of these things up, basically Leavis condemns Shelley for what he calls his weak grasp upon the actual. A very famous line. And then he adds this, actually, that quivering intensity, which is how he describes Shelley's poetry, offered in itself apart from any substance, offered instead of any object, is what, though it may make Shelley intoxicating at 15, makes him almost unreadable, except in very small quantities of his best to the mature. What Leavis means here is that people may like Shelley when they're 15 years old, when their imagination is in the clouds and they're very sensitive and emotional and things like that. But as you grow up and you become more intellectual and you become more practical, then you realize that Shelley basically gives you all feeling and no substance. He is too romantic, and we kind of have to back off a little bit and not get so intoxicated by all this language. Other critics have said similar things. So Donald Davy, for instance, has a phrase where he says, "For Shelley goes as far as poetry can go, while it uses intelligible language in cutting the hawsers," those are the ropes that tie the ship to the shore, "which tie his fancies to the ground." In other words, Shelley is off in dreamland, he's floating, he's flying, but he needs to be more tethered to reality. Reality doesn't look like what he's describing. So how do we respond to this? Well, one way to respond is to say, actually, the imagery makes sense, and some critics go this way. So Harold Bloom, for instance, objects to this idea that clouds aren't really falling in the same way as leaves and things like that. He says, Shelley does not necessarily compare clouds and leaves, but he does compare the process of shedding. Okay, so this verb shed, in other words, is the critical thing. There are two things that are shed, two things that are falling, and that's where the point of comparison is. I think that's narrowing it down way too much, because of course Shelley is trying to bring the two images together. I mean, that's the point of the passage. So to only focus on the action, on the verb, I think is ridiculous. Sorry to put it so strongly. This is all about the power of the imagination. So if you're enjoying the description, don't feel ashamed about that. Just say to yourself, hey, I have an imagination. I can use this. I can see how these things come together. That's actually really a beautiful image. The other thing to remember is that this imagery is all about confusion. It's okay to have imagery that's confused because the sublime is greatest when we feel kind of overwhelmed, when our emotions can't take it all in. And so it's important that we recognize that this entire poem is complex and that it uses complexity to create the sublime. So I hope that helps a little bit with stanza 2. As you can see, much talked about, much debated. Stanza 3, as we'll see, is not quite as controversial. It's a beautiful stanza that compares the Mediterranean to the Atlantic in terms of how the west wind affects both of them.